Joe Rogan, one of the biggest pioneers of the UFC and also one of the biggest names in the entire MMA community. But during his time, he's had some absurd takes. So we're going to be ranking every absurd Joe Rogan take that he's had over the years on a tier list. S tier being I can kind of get behind this take that Joe Rogan has said. I kind of agree with it. And then D tier being I don't know what went through his head when he said this, but this is one of the worst takes I've ever seen in combat sports in general. And it's definitely something he should be disgraced for. Starting with the first take, which is that fights should take place on a football field instead of the octagon. Yeah, Joe Rogan's got this weird primal thing where he wants a fight to be as natural as possible, and he isn't a fan of the idea of an octagon because he doesn't feel like it's a natural fight. He suggested that a football field or even like an open mat like they do in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu should be the alternative to an octagon in the UFC. This would kill the sport. This would... Can you imagine like a Leon Edwards or a Sean Strickland competing on an open mat? They're already as boring as it is in an octagon. Imagine them competing on like an open field like Ilia Topuria, who specializes getting his opponents against the cage on an open field. This would kill the sport. If fights aren't bad enough as they are normally, this would drive it into financial issues immediately. This is going all the way in a C tier immediately. Yeah, it would kill the sport. A football field instead of an octagon. I don't see the issue with an octagon. I think it's a staple in MMA. When you think of MMA, you think of an octagon. I don't know what possible benefits a football field could bring. There'd be too much space. There'd be too many boring fights. Like imagine being a pressure fighter having to compete on a football field or even like an open mat. I hate the idea of this. It would drive the UFC into financial issues. The fights would be extremely boring. There'd be no cutting people off. There'd be no backing people against the cage. There's a reason why you don't see this in boxing. There's a reason why you don't see it in kickboxing. And there's a reason why you don't see it in MMA. It would be boring. There'd be too much space. This is going to go straight into C tier. It would kill the UFC. Maybe that's Joe Rogan's plan. He wants to kill the UFC so he can get an early retirement, but that's going in C tier. One of Joe Rogan's worst takes. But not as bad as him saying that Ronda Rousey could beat 50% of men's bantamweights. I don't think I've ever seen a bigger fan of Ronda Rousey in her prime than Joe Rogan. And this wasn't even one of the worst ones. He also said that Ronda Rousey could beat Floyd Mayweather in a fight if they were to get in like a street fight, which is another terrible take that I haven't added to this list. But I've added this one instead, that Ronda Rousey could beat 50% of men's bantamweights. I don't know what it was that made Joe Rogan think that Ronda Rousey, of all fighters, could be the one to beat 50% of men's bantamweights. A Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu judo expert who had subpar striking and got knocked out by Holly Holm, but yet she could be the guy, or she could be the woman to beat 50% of men's bantamweights. This isn't just a take of him saying, or maybe Ronda Rousey could beat 1 or 2 bantamweights on the roster, or even a flyweights for that matter. Half of the men's bantamweights could get beaten by Ronda Rousey. That's going straight into D tier. And this is one of his worst Ronda Rousey takes. And he said a lot of bad stuff about Ronda Rousey, like hyping her up to be the next big thing, and then she gets smashed to pieces when she faces elite competition. Yeah, this is one of the worst things I've ever heard come out of his mouth. I had to double check if this was like legitimately real at first. But yeah, this is awful. She couldn't beat any men in the UFC in history. There's not a single man in the UFC that Ronda Rousey could have beat. You can pick the worst flyweight male on the roster, and they could still probably beat the shit out of Ronda Rousey. There's maybe a few fighters on the regional scene who could probably lose to Ronda Rousey because, you know, they're awful. But in the UFC, the premier organization of the UFC, the thing that 50%, again, not just 1 or 2, but 50% of the men's bantamweights could beat Ronda Rousey is one of the worst takes. Even if like Amanda Nunes, if you would have said this about Amanda Nunes, who's one of the most dominant women MMA fighters in history, even that's a bad take. But for Ronda Rousey, she'd get put to sleep immediately by any men's bantamweight. One of Joe Rogan's worst takes, and one of the worst attempts at trying to hype up Ronda Rousey I've ever seen. And that probably explains why he cried when she retired. The next take is that steel cups impact armbars. If you've ever been watching a UFC fight while Joe Rogan's on commentary and there happens to be an armbar, you've likely heard the phrase that steel cups impact armbars. He's got kind of a few catchphrases in the UFC, just Joe Rogan, and this is one of them. Every single time there's an armbar in the UFC, he loves to, remind us that steel cups, they can affect armbars. He also likes to bring up the fact that they can, they're quite dangerous, because he said on Demetrius Johnson, when Demetrius Johnson was on his podcast, that if you accidentally kick someone in the balls, you could potentially break your foot. Well, the whole point is that you don't kick someone in the balls, so that shouldn't matter in the first place. I'm going to put this one in B tier. It's not as bad as the other ones. I can see where he's coming from. He does bring up a point. Steel cups do impact armbars because you're obviously bending it on metal rather than just normal padding. So I can see where he's coming from. He's not wrong. It can cause, breaking people's foots when you accidentally hit a groin shot, but it's the fact that he brings it up in every single UFC event, like once or twice a year, fair enough, but every single time there's an armbar, you don't need to remind us that steel cups impact armbars, and the impact that Joe Rogan seems to think they have is nowhere near as big as it is. If you're in an armbar and it's a tight locked in armbar, 9 times out of 10, 99 times out of 100, you're getting submitted. You know what I mean? So the steel cup isn't going to bring that much of an impact to it. So the fact that Joe Rogan brings it up at every pay-per-view, I'm going to put it in B tier. Not one of his worst takes. I can see where it's coming from, but please shut up about it now, Joe Rogan. We understand that steel comes in back down bars. Maybe he's got some sort of dementia, which is why these takes are so bad and he keeps repeating them. But anyway, next take is that back of the head shot should be legal. Now, I kid you not, I had to double check that this one was real. This has been going around a lot recently, and I had to double check. I thought maybe somebody has seen the amount of bad takes that Joe Rogan has come out with, and then they've just whipped this one and attached Joe Rogan's name to it to kind of be funny. But no, not only has he said this once, he said this on multiple occasions. This isn't just something that slipped out one time on a podcast. He's brought this up multiple times, that back of the head shot should be legal. He said, I don't even know if we should stop hitting people in the back of the head. It doesn't make any sense to me, and it should be legal. For a guy that's been around the UFC and combat sports for the longest time, this guy's been a pioneer. He's been around for decades, and he's even suggested that back of the head shot should be legal. He obviously hasn't seen the fatalities and the casualties that has took place in boxing, for example, with Pritchard Colon, where back of the head shot's going to cause comas, obviously lead to people being blind and lead to people dying. And Joe Rogan suggested that this should be in the UFC. I don't know if he wants to see death. I know I said earlier about the whole primal thing where Joe Rogan wants it to be as natural as possible. But this would have just killed the UFC. This would kill fighters. You know, imagine like Francis Ngannou has like Derek Lewis or some other fat heavyweight mounted, and he's on top position, just absolutely elbowing the shit out of people on the back of the head of people. People would die. So, yeah, this one's going to go in detail for obvious reasons. I can't believe that Joe Rogan even suggested this. This is probably his worst take of all time. And this isn't even something he said in like 2017 while he was high on a podcast with Joey Diaz. This is something he said on multiple different occasions recently as well. He said it in the past couple of years. For Joe Rogan, of all people, to not understand the effects of back of the head shots, there's a reason it's not in boxing. There's a reason it's not in kickboxing. There's a reason it's not in MMA. People would die. People would become obviously fatal. People would be put into comas. It would kill people. And there's a reason there's been no deaths in the UFC. This would stop them. So this one, no-brainer, going in detail. I can't believe Joe Rogan, of all people, has brought this up. This is something I'd expect from maybe like Stephen A. Smith, who's come from basketball and doesn't really know what he's talking about. But for Joe Rogan's sakes, detail, quite possibly might be Joe Rogan's worst take. Next one is that weight cutting should be banned. Yeah, Joe Rogan's been very vocal that he doesn't like the idea of weight cutting. He thinks it's sanctioned cheating, in his own words, and that weight cutting should be banned. Not necessarily always be banned, but he said it should either be banned or it should be changed and altered and maybe add a few more weight classes, maybe change the whole idea of weight cutting to maybe it being a couple hours before a UFC event takes place rather than the night before. I'm going to stick this one. I'm going to put this one in A tier. This is I somewhat agree with this take from Joe Rogan. Compared to the rest, I can kind of get behind this one. I do think that weight cutting kind of needs to be changed. I'm not saying we need to add about 50 weight classes, and I don't think it should be banned, as Joe Rogan has said, because that would just cause too much complications for the UFC, and I think combat sports kind of needs weight cutting to kind of formulate the idea of weight classes, but it would eliminate, obviously eliminate weight bullies. Fighters pulling out last minute due to not being able to make weight. Fighters' health would be massively, the fighters' health was already at stake with weight cutting, so removing the idea of weight cutting could obviously impact the fighters' health. And I think if we are going to see a fatality in the UFC, one of the biggest reasons could be from a weight cut. We've seen it in different organizations, we've seen it in boxing, so I feel like it is a matter of time. So I can kind of get behind this take that Joe Rogan has said of weight cutting being banned. I don't think it's one of his worst takes. I'll stick this one in A tier. The next one we've got is that fighters shouldn't be stood up for stalling. Now, obviously in the UFC, if you're a wrestler and you take your opponent down, you're expected to improve your position, you're expected to deal damage with ground and pound, you're expected to look for submissions, you're expected to be busy. You're not allowed to kind of just stall on the ground, lay on your opponent and not do anything with the position. But Joe Rogan, the genius over here, just has to let us know how much of a fan he is of grappling and how much of a hardcore fan he is of martial arts. That he suggested that if you are taking an opponent down and you don't do anything to improve your position, the idea of standing your opponents up should just be eliminated. If you get taken down, tough shit if it's boring. Again, similar to the whole open field idea, it would kill the UFC. I don't know if this is Joe Rogan's plan to kind of get rid of the UFC and kill it, and maybe he's got a secret promotion, deal with PFL or a different promotion, but this one's going to go straight into C tier. Yeah, the idea of not being able to stand your opponents up would kill the organization. And I think of how many casual fans, and I made a video about this a few weeks ago, hate the idea of wrestling. Imagine how much they'd hate it even more if they couldn't get stood up. Imagine Shamil Gaziev lands a lucky takedown against, like, I don't know, just any heavyweight, and then he just decides to lay there for the entire fight, squeezes, lays there, doesn't decide to get up. It would ruin the UFC. It would kill the sports. The idea of wrestlers being boring would get, the idea of that would be astronomically increased because they just lead to stalling. Whoever can stall the most wins the fight. And this is not what we need after we saw Mario Batista versus Jose Aldo. And that was one of the better ideas of it. Imagine Mario Batista against the cage 25 minutes straight against a champion. That'd be awful. Anyway, yeah, this is going to go straight to C tier. It kills the sport. Wrestling would be extremely boring. I like the idea of people getting mauled, people getting submitted, beating the shit out of on the ground and battered with wrestling. I like high level high-level wrestling matches, but the idea of stalling, I can't think of one possible benefit this could bring to the UFC or the overall MMA experience, so that's going to go in C tier. Again, I don't know what he's thinking. Next take was that Jorge Masvidal could beat Prime GSP and is a better fighter than Prime GSP. Now, maybe he said this because Masvidal was about to go on his podcast and he wanted to kind of hype Masvidal up, but Joe Rogan suggested that Jorge Masvidal, because of the competition increase, was better than Prime GSP. Again, I don't know what was going through Joe Rogan's head. I don't know what could possibly bring him to say this. It's one thing saying this about Kamaru Usman, who's the best welterweight of this generation. You know, you make an argument to say that he might be better than GSP because obviously he's been facing the newer competition than GSP and whatever. And even like a Tyron Woodley for that sake. But Jorge Masvidal, a win-loss fighter who had a fluky win over Ben Askren, knocked out Darren Till, who's no longer in the UFC, and got a doctor stoppage whatever Nate Diaz, could beat the greatest welterweight and one of the greatest of all time in MMA for that reason. Yeah, this one's going to go straight into this one will go straight to C tier. Again, one of Joe Rogan's worst takes. It would be bad enough saying it about Tyron Woodley, but Jorge Masvidal of all people, if they like look at the skill set between the two of them. GSP is the most skilled fighter apart from Demetrius Johnson of all time. Jorge Masvidal is a good boxer. It was quick on the feet in his prime. Awful wrestler. That's all you can really say about Jorge Masvidal. Win-loss fighter. Was lucky to even get a title shot against Usman. I'm not saying he was undeserved, but he shouldn't have been in there with Usman in the first place. So Jorge Masvidal being even anywhere close to the level of GSP is going to go straight into C tier. I mean, again, a Tyron Woodley would maybe make it to B tier, but Masvidal, it's going in C tier. I don't know what Joe Rogan was thinking. Next take is that John Jones versus Alex Pereira should have been made instead of John Jones and Tom Aspinall. Now, after UFC 303, when Alex Pereira finished Nebraska, multiple times throughout this card, Joe Rogan kept bringing up the idea of Alex versus Jones. He said it during the fight. He said it in the post-fight Octagon interview. He said it after when he was reviewing the card with John Anik and DC that I say let him with Alex Pereira going up to the heavyweight division to face John Jones, despite the fact that Tom Aspinall was the interim champion and that was the most demanded fight in the UFC at the time. And by the way, he still is. Why hasn't that fight been made? Yeah, this is an awful take from Joe Rogan. Again, another fighter that he was obsessed with, a fight that he was obsessed with Jones and Alex, despite Tom Aspinall being the interim champion. This kills the UFC. This is exactly what we don't need. This gets rid of the entire idea of the best versus the best. This one's going to go in B tier, which is crazy because any other MMA fan said this, it's probably a D or C tier take, but Joe Rogan's takes have been so bad on this list so far. I'm going to give him the benefit of the doubt and put it in B tier. It wouldn't kill the UFC. It would be a high pay-per-view selling fight. It would be kind of intriguing because they're two big names, but first of all, would it be competitive? John Jones takes him down and subs him in the very first round. It's not a super fight for that matter. And obviously, Tom Aspinall's the interim champion. You watched him win the belt over Sergey Pavlovich when he knocked out Sergey Pavlovich. You were there commentating live. And he defended it against Curtis Blades. And he still wants to see John Jones versus Alex Pereira. Even after Jones beat Stipe, it was talking about this fight instead of the Aspinall fight. So this whole idea of Pereira versus Jones being a super fight bigger than Aspinall and Jones in terms of hardcore fans and just what we want to see in general, it's going to go in B tier. The next take is that Ryan Hall would be the next big thing. Yeah, there's something that Joe Rogan has between Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu fighters and just grapplers in general that he's obsessed with. Because Joe Rogan, he just has to let us know how much of a hardcore fan he is of grappling. He was hyping up Ryan Hall so much. He thought he was going to be the next big thing in the UFC. He was his favorite prospect in the UFC. It was a hard watch when Ryan Hall was taking on Ilia Topuria because that entire fight was about 20 failed heel hooks, and every single time Joe Rogan was still backing Ryan Hall, still hyping him up. The crowd were booing at one point, and rightfully so, because there was no action in the fight. It was just failed heel hook attempts, and Joe Rogan called them uneducated mouth breathers because they couldn't appreciate the failed heel hook attempts from Ryan Hall. And then eventually Ilia Topuria goes to the ground and pound finish, and Joe Rogan said it's a mistake going to the ground with Ryan Hall. And then he gets put out cold, and Joe Rogan eats his words. This one's going to go in a B tier as well. It's not as bad compared to the others. He just overhyped the prospect, but it's definitely on the lower end of B tier. I don't know what Joe Rogan saw in Ryan Hall. It isn't even like he's a Rodolfo Vieira or like a Royce Gracie at his time where he was just submitting people left, right, and center. He had a good heel hook. He was awful on the feet, and he was getting smashed to pieces by Ilia Topuria. I don't know what hype Joe Rogan saw in this guy that he doesn't see in other people, but this is going to go in B tier. Again, one of Joe Rogan's worst commentary mistakes and one of his worst takes of all time, but that is going to be me ranking some absurd takes from Joe Rogan. Let me know if you agree with the placements of these takes, if there should have been any other takes that I should have added to this list. Let me know your thoughts. Thank you for watching.